The terminal hummed with soft conversations as travelers shuffled through the bustling airport. The unmistakable chatter of departure announcements filled the air, accompanied by the occasional sound of luggage wheels gliding over the polished floor. Among the crowd, a young girl, no older than 12, stood quietly next to her father. Her dark, curly hair framed her innocent face, her eyes wide with curiosity as she clutched a well-worn backpack that seemed to carry her whole world inside. She glanced up at her father, a tall man with a composed demeanor, dressed in an understated yet impeccably tailored suit. He had a presence about him, calm yet commanding, a quality that turned heads without him trying. He smiled down at her, offering a reassuring nod as they approached the gate for their flight. As they stepped into the line for boarding, the air around them seemed to shift. The flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp features and an even sharper tone, stood at the gate, scanning tickets with practiced efficiency. Her crisp uniform and tight bun gave off an air of authority, but her expression betrayed a certain impatience, one that only grew sharper when her eyes landed on the young girl. "Excuse me," the attendant said, her voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. "This line is for priority boarding." The man raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unwavering. "We are priority," he said, handing over their boarding passes. The young girl shifted uncomfortably under the flight attendant's scrutinizing gaze. The attendant took one look at the tickets, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I think you're mistaken," she said, her tone clipped. "This section is for first-class passengers only." The girl's father remained composed, his voice steady. "That's correct. These are first-class tickets." The woman's eyes narrowed, her demeanor taking on a patronizing edge. "Sir, I don't think you understand. First class is reserved for certain guests. I'll need you to step aside and let the other passengers through." The young girl's cheeks flushed, her small hands tightening around her backpack straps. She looked up at her father, unsure of what to do. His expression didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, though not directed at her. "Is there a problem here?" a second flight attendant asked, stepping over to the gate. She danced between the man, the girl, and her colleague. "No problem," the first attendant said quickly, though her tone was less than convincing. She leaned closer to the second attendant, lowering her voice. "They're claiming to be first-class passengers, but—" Before she could finish, the girl's father calmly interrupted. "Is there a manager I can speak with? I'd like to address this situation before we board." The first attendant blinked, taken aback by the directness of his request. "A manager," she repeated as if the word itself were foreign. "Yes," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I'd like to speak with someone in charge." The young girl shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her gaze darting between her father and the attendant. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could feel the tension growing around them. The murmur of nearby passengers grew louder, some of them glancing curiously in their direction. "Look," the first attendant said, her voice dropping to a condescending whisper, "I'm just trying to do my job. I have procedures to follow, and frankly, this is holding up the line." Her father took a deep breath, his patience clearly being tested. "I understand you have a job to do," he said, his tone measured. "But my daughter and I are paying customers, and we have every right to be here. Now, please get your manager." The attendant hesitated, her cheeks flushing slightly as she realized the conversation had drawn the attention of several passengers nearby. She glanced at the tickets again, as if hoping to find some loophole that would validate her behavior. But before she could say anything more, the second attendant stepped in. "I'll get the manager," she said quickly, giving her colleague a pointed look before disappearing down the corridor. The young girl's father placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch steady and warm. "Don't worry," he said softly, crouching slightly to meet her eyes. "We'll get this sorted out." The girl nodded, though her gaze remained on the first attendant, who was now avoiding eye contact altogether. Her father straightened, his calm exterior unshaken, as they waited for the manager to arrive. The minutes stretched on, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. The crowd around them grew restless, the quiet murmurs turning into audible whispers. The first attendant crossed her arms, her posture stiff as she avoided looking directly at the man or his daughter. When the manager finally arrived, a middle-aged man with an air of authority, the young girl's father greeted him with the same calm politeness he had maintained throughout the ordeal. The first attendant quickly launched into an explanation, her words rushed and defensive. But the manager raised a hand, silencing her mid-sentence. "Let me take a look at the tickets," he said, his tone neutral but firm. As he examined the boarding passes, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He straightened, his expression shifting from neutrality to something bordering on alarm. "Sir," he began, his voice tinged with an almost reverent respect. "I wasn't aware you were traveling with us today." The first attendant frowned, clearly caught off guard by the manager's sudden change in demeanor. She glanced between him and the man, her confusion evident. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding," the manager continued, handing the tickets back to the young girl's father. "I deeply apologize for any inconvenience caused. Please allow me to personally escort you and your daughter to your seats." The first attendant's jaw dropped slightly, her confusion giving way to disbelief. "Wait, what?" she stammered, looking between the manager and the man. "Who is he?" The manager hesitated, glancing at the man for permission before responding. The young girl's father gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "He's the owner of the airline," the manager said, his voice low but steady. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their implication. The first attendant's face drained of color, her earlier confidence replaced by a look of utter shock. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The young girl's father turned to his daughter, offering her a gentle smile. "Ready to board?" he asked, his tone light and reassuring. She nodded, her small hand slipping into his as they stepped forward, leaving the stunned flight attendant and the murmuring crowd behind them. But as they walked toward the plane, the young girl couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, and she was right. The hum of the airplane engines filled the air as the young girl and her father settled into their spacious first-class seats. The cabin was immaculate, with plush leather chairs and attendants bustling about, offering refreshments and warm towels. Yet, despite the comfort, an uneasy silence hung between them. The girl glanced around, her curiosity pulling her attention in a dozen directions. She had never flown like this before. Everything felt larger than life. The seats, the service, the sheer luxury of it all. But her father's composed demeanor hadn't changed. He sat quietly, his face calm, but his eyes distant, as if his thoughts were somewhere far from the polished cabin. "Dad," the girl finally whispered, breaking the silence. Why did she act like that? The lady at the gate. Her father turned to her, his expression softening. He took a deep breath, as though weighing his words carefully. Sometimes people make assumptions, sweetheart. They look at someone and think they already know who they are. It's not right, but it happens. She frowned, her young mind trying to piece together the puzzle. "But we had the tickets. Why didn't she just let us through?" Her father's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze drifting out the small window. "It wasn't about the tickets," he said quietly. "It was about us." The girl tilted her head, confused. "What do you mean?" He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "You'll understand more as you get older," he said, his voice carrying a weight that felt far beyond her years. "But for now, just remember this. You never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. You have every right to be where you are, no matter what anyone says." She nodded slowly, his words sinking in even if she didn't fully grasp their depth. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, her father leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as though trying to push the earlier incident out of his mind. But for the young girl, the memory lingered. She couldn't shake the image of the flight attendant's stern face or the way her voice had sharpened when she spoke to them. It made her chest feel tight, like she had done something wrong even though she knew she hadn't. Minutes later, the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, and the attendants began their rounds. The girl watched as one of them approached with a tray of sparkling water and juice. This attendant was different, kinder, with a warm smile that immediately put her at ease. "Good evening," the attendant said softly, bending slightly to speak to the girl at eye level. "Would you like something to drink?" The girl hesitated, glancing at her father for approval. He nodded, and she turned back to the attendant. "Orange juice, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The attendant handed her a glass with a kind smile. "Here you go, sweetie. Let me know if you need anything else." As the attendant moved on, the girl sipped her juice, the sweetness a small comfort in the midst of her swirling thoughts. She leaned back in her seat, staring out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about the gate agent's reaction when she learned her father owned the airline. "Dad," she said after a long silence, "why didn't you tell her who you were right away?" Her father opened his eyes, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about who I am," he said. "It's about how people treat others, regardless of titles or wealth. If she hadn't known, would her behavior have changed? Probably not. And that's the real problem." The girl frowned, her brow furrowing as she considered his words. "But you could have stopped her from being mean sooner," she said quietly. He sighed, his gaze turning inward. Sometimes it's not about stopping people. It's about holding them accountable for their actions. If I had told her right away, she might have apologized, but would she have truly learned from it, or would she have just covered her tracks? The girl nodded slowly, though her young mind still struggled to understand the complexities of what he was saying. To her, it seemed simple. If someone was mean, you told them to stop. But her father's world, she was beginning to realize, wasn't always so straightforward. The hours passed and the cabin grew quieter as passengers settled into their routines. Some read books or watched movies, while others dozed off under soft blankets. The girl stared out the window, her thoughts racing. Her father had always been her rock, steady, kind, and unshakable. But today she had seen a new side of him, one that made her realize he carried a weight she hadn't fully understood before. As the flight continued, she found herself replaying the scene at the gate over and over. There was something about it that didn't sit right with her, something she couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just the way the attendant had spoken to them. It was the look in her eyes, the unspoken assumption that they didn't belong. It made her feel small, like no matter how hard she tried, she would never be enough in some people's eyes. Her father, sensing her unease, reached over and took her hand. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the window. "Yeah," she said softly. "Just thinking." He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's okay to think," he said. "It's how we learn and grow. Just don't let those thoughts make you doubt yourself, okay? You're strong, and you're smart. Don't ever forget that." She turned to him, offering a small smile. "Thanks, Dad." He smiled back, the warmth in his eyes chasing away some of the lingering tension. "Anytime," he said. But as the plane continued its journey, the girl couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they landed. Would the flight attendant from the gate try to apologize? Would her father let it go, or would he address the situation further? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. She glanced over at her father, who had once again closed his eyes, his breathing steady and calm. For now, she decided she would try to do the same. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway, the soft thud pulling the young girl from her restless thoughts. She glanced at her father, who was already gathering his belongings with his usual calm efficiency. Outside the window, the sprawling airport stretched out in all directions, its bright lights reflecting off the rain-slicked tarmac. "Ready?" her father asked, giving her a reassuring smile. She nodded, though her stomach churned with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. The earlier incident at the gate still weighed on her, and the questions had stirred remained unanswered. As they stepped into the aisle, the flight attendants offered polite smiles and farewells, their voices warm and professional. But the girl couldn't help noticing that one attendant, the kind woman who had brought her juice earlier, seemed to linger as they passed. Her gaze followed them, a flicker of something in her expression that the girl couldn't quite place. Was it curiosity? Concern? Whatever it was, it made her chest tighten. As they exited the plane and entered the bustling terminal, the atmosphere felt charged. Her father walked with the same steady confidence as always, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. But she could sense an undercurrent of tension in him, something he was working hard to mask. They didn't make it far before a uniformed man approached, his posture stiff and formal. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice carrying the kind of respect reserved for someone important. "Welcome back, sir. We've arranged a car to take you to your destination." Her father nodded, his expression polite but distant. "Thank you," he said simply. The young girl stayed close by his side as they followed the man through the terminal. She couldn't help but notice the way people seemed to part for them, their eyes flickering with curiosity or recognition. It was something she had seen before but never paid much attention to, until now. The ride to their hotel was quiet, the car gliding through the city streets as rain pattered softly against the windows. Her father stared out at the passing buildings, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. The girl wanted to ask him what was on his mind, but something in his expression made her hesitate. Instead, she leaned against the cool window, her own thoughts a tangled mess. When they arrived at the hotel, the staff greeted them with the same deference that seemed to follow her father everywhere. The young girl clutched her backpack tightly as they were escorted to a luxurious suite, the kind of place she still wasn't used to, no matter how often they traveled. The suite was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Her father set his suitcase down and turned to her. "Why don't you get comfortable?" he said, his tone gentle. "We'll order some room service in a bit." She nodded, slipping off her shoes and wandering over to the window. The city below sparkled like a sea of stars, and for a moment, She allowed herself to get lost in the view, but her peace was short-lived. A soft knock at the door pulled her attention back to the present. Her father opened the door to reveal a man in a tailored suit, his expression serious but polite. "Mr. Hayes," the man said, inclining his head slightly. "I'd like a moment of your time, if I may." Her father glanced at her, his gaze briefly meeting hers before he stepped into the hallway with the man. The door closed behind them, leaving the girl alone in the vast suite. She wandered over to the couch, her curiosity gnawing at her. Who was the man? What did he want? She didn't have to wait long to find out. When her father returned, his face was calm, but there was a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there before. He sat down beside her, letting out a long sigh. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. He hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, everything's fine," he said, but the way he avoided her gaze told her otherwise. Later that evening, as they sat together over plates of room-service pasta, her father seemed lost in thought. She wanted to ask him about the man at the door, about what he had said, but something held her back. Instead, she focused on her food, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. The next morning, they returned to the airport for another flight. This time, everything seemed to go smoothly. No rude gate attendants, no delays, but the girl couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her father's usual calmness felt more like a shield than a reflection of his true feelings. As they boarded the plane, she noticed the kind flight attendant from their previous flight. The woman's eyes widened slightly when she saw them, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to her father. He acknowledged her with a polite smile, but said nothing. The flight passed uneventfully, but the girl's mind was anything but quiet. She kept thinking about the gate attendant from the first flight, about the look on her face when she realized who her father was. It wasn't just surprise, it was fear, and now she couldn't stop wondering why. When they landed and exited the plane, the kind flight attendant caught up with them. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly, her tone careful, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened during your last flight. That shouldn't have happened." Her father nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said simply. The woman hesitated, glancing at the girl before continuing. "If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." Her father gave her a small, polite smile. "I appreciate that," he said. Then, with a nod, he guided his daughter toward the terminal exit. The girl looked up at him as they walked, her curiosity finally getting the better of her. "Dad," she said quietly. Why was she apologizing? She didn't do anything wrong. Her father's jaw tightened slightly, but his tone remained calm. "Sometimes people take responsibility for things they weren't directly involved in," he said. "It shows character." She frowned, not entirely satisfied with his answer. But why didn't the other lady apologize? He paused, glancing down at her. "Some people find it harder to admit when they're wrong," he said. "And sometimes it takes time for them to realize they were wrong in the first place." As they stepped out into the bustling terminal, the girl couldn't help but feel that her father's words held more weight than she understood. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was still unclear. And as they made their way to their next destination, she realized that the answers she sought might be more complicated and more important than she had ever imagined. As the car pulled away from the airport, the city unfolded before them like a restless ocean of lights and movement. The young girl sat quietly beside her father, clutching her backpack. She had so many questions but felt unsure how to ask them. Her father seemed lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the passing streets but seeing something far beyond them. The driver's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Hayes," he said, glancing into the rearview mirror, "I received word that the board will be convening for a meeting later today. They've requested your presence." Her father nodded, his expression calm, but his lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you for letting me know. Please take us to the hotel first." The girl studied her father's face, noticing how the mention of the meeting seemed to weigh on him. "What's the board?" she asked softly. "It's a group of people who help make decisions about the airline," he explained, his tone gentle but distant. "They oversee operations and ensure everything runs smoothly." "Are they upset about something?" she asked, tilting her head. Her father hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "It's hard to say," he replied, "but meetings like this usually mean there's an issue to address." The girl frowned, sensing there was more to his words than he was letting on. She thought back to the flight attendant at the gate, the way she had acted as though they didn't belong. It seemed connected somehow, though she couldn't quite piece it all together. When they arrived at the hotel, her father stepped out first, scanning the entrance with a subtle but purposeful glance before guiding her inside. The lobby was grand, its marble floors and towering chandeliers gleaming under the soft glow of warm nights. But even amidst the luxury, the girl felt a sense of unease. They were shown to their suite, a spacious room with sweeping views of the city skyline. Her father set his suitcase aside and loosened his tie, his movements slow and deliberate. He seemed tired, not just physically but in a way she couldn't quite describe, like he was carrying something heavy that no one else could see. "Dad," she said after a moment, her voice small. "Is this about what happened at the gate?" He looked at her, his expression softening. "What makes you ask that?" She shrugged, fidgeting with the strap of her backpack. "It just feels like everyone's acting different, like something big is happening." Her father sighed, sitting down beside her. "You're very observant," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "And you're not wrong. What happened at the gate wasn't just about us. It's part of a bigger problem, one that I've been working to fix for a long time." She tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "What kind of problem?" He hesitated, his gaze distant. "It's complicated," he said finally. "But let's just say that not everyone treats people the way they should. Sometimes they make assumptions based on things that have nothing to do with who a person really is. And sometimes those assumptions can cause real harm." The girl thought about this, her young mind working to untangle the threads of what he was saying. "Like the lady at the gate?" she asked. Her father nodded, his expression serious. "Exactly like her." "But you didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Why would she treat us like that?" He sighed again, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Because in her mind, we didn't fit the picture of what she thought we should be. And that's a problem she has to face, not us." The girl nodded slowly, her father's words sinking in. But even as she tried to understand, a part of her still felt angry. It wasn't fair and it didn't make sense. Why would someone act that way without even knowing them? The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of quiet moments and unanswered questions. Her father prepared for his meeting, his focus sharp and unwavering. But as he adjusted his tie in the mirror, she noticed the faint tension in his jaw, the subtle way his hands lingered on the knot longer than usual. "Will you be okay?" she asked, standing in the doorway. He turned to her, his expression softening into a smile. "Of course," he said, "it's just a meeting." But she could tell it wasn't just a meeting. There was something more at stake, something important. And as much as she wanted to press him for answers, she knew he wouldn't tell her. Not yet. When he left for the boardroom, the suite felt strangely empty. The girl sat by the window, staring out at the city below. Her thoughts drifted back to the flight attendant, the way her voice had sounded so cold, so certain. It made her chest tighten all over again. She wondered what was happening in the meeting. Were they talking about the gate incident? About her father? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more urgent than the last. She wished she could be there to hear what was being said, to understand what was really going on. Hours passed and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the city in hues of orange and pink. Still, her father didn't return. The longer he was gone, the more her worry grew. She tried to distract herself with the TV, but the noise only made her feel more restless. Finally, just as the first stars began to appear in the night sky, the door opened. Her father stepped inside, his face calm but his eyes heavy with unspoken emotions. He loosened his tie and set his briefcase down, the gesture slow and deliberate. "Did it go okay?" she asked, standing up from the couch. He paused, meeting her gaze. "It went as expected," he said, his tone careful. She frowned, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. "What does that mean?" He gave her a small, tired smile. "It means there's still work to be done," he said. "But we're getting there." She nodded, though his words left her with more questions than answers. As they sat together in the quiet suite, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something big, something that would change everything. And whatever it was, she knew it wasn't over yet.